The system verified that I was on the chat room's access list and allowed me to enter. My view of the classroom shrank from the limits of my peripheral vision to a small thumbnail window in the lower right hand of my display, allowing me to monitor what was in front of my avatar whilst enjoying the chat room. The rest of my field of vision was now filled with the interior of H's chat room. My avatar appeared just inside the entrance, a door at the top of a carpeted staircase. The door didn't lead anywhere. It didn't even open. This was because the basement and its contents didn't exist as a part of the Oasis. Chat rooms were standalone simulations, temporary virtual spaces that avatars could access from anywhere in Oasis. My avatar wasn't actually in the chat room. It only appeared that way. Wade 3 and Percival were still in their history classrooms with their eyes closed. Logging into a chat room was a little like being in two places at once. H had named his chat room the basement. He had programmed it to look like a large suburban rec room circa the late 80s. Old movie and comic posters covered the walls. A vintage RCA television stood in the corner of the room, hooked up to a Betamax VCR. On top of that sat a laser disc player and several vintage video game consoles. Bookshelves lined the far walls, filled with role-playing game supplements and back issues of Dragon magazine. Hosting a chat room this large wasn't cheap, but H could afford it. He had made quite a bit of dough competing in televised PvP arenas. H was one of the highest ranked combatants in the Oasis, in both Deathmatch and Capture the Flag leagues. He was even more famous than Artemis. Over the past few years, the basement had become a highly exclusive hangout for elite Gunters. H granted access only to people he deemed worthy, so being invited to hang out in the basement was a big honor, especially for a third-level nobody like myself. As I descended the staircase, I saw a few dozen other Gunters milling around, with avatars that varied wildly in appearance. There were humans, cyborgs, demons, dark elves and Vulcans, vampires and werewolves. Most of them were gathered around a row of old arcade games against the wall. A few others stood by an ancient stereo, currently blasting The Wild Boys by Duran Duran. Browsing through H's giant rack of vintage cassette tapes, some others were chatting about something. H himself was sprawled on one of the chat room's 3 couches, which were arrayed in a U shape in front of the television. H's avatar was a tall, broad-shouldered Caucasian male with dark brown hair and brown eyes. I had asked him once if he looked anything like his avatar in real life, and he had jokingly replied, "Yes, but in real life, I'm even more handsome." As I walked over, he glanced up from the Intellivision game he was playing. His distinctive Cheshire grin stretched from ear to ear. "Z!" he shouted. "What's up, amigo?" He stretched out his right hand and gave me 5 as I dropped onto the couch opposite him. H had started calling me Z shortly after I met him. He liked to give people single-letter nicknames. H pronounced his own avatar's name, just like the letter H, but it was spelled A-E-C-H. "What up, Humperdinck?" I said. This was a game we played. I always called him by some random H name, like Harry, Hubert, Henry, or Hogan. I was making guesses at his real first name, which, he had once confided in me, began with the letter H. I had known H for a little over 3 years. He was also a student on Ludus, a senior at OPS 1172, which was on the opposite side of the planet from my school. We had met one weekend in a public Gunter chat room and hit it off immediately because we shared all the same interests, which is, to say one interest, a total all-consuming obsession with Halliday and his Easter egg. A few minutes into our first conversation, I knew H was the real deal, an elite Gunter with some serious mental kung fu. He had his 80s trivia down cold, and not just the canon stuff either. He was a true Halliday scholar, and he had apparently seen the same qualities in me, because he had given me his contact card and invited me to hang out in his basement whenever I liked. He had been my closest friend ever since. Over the years, a friendly rivalry had gradually developed between us. We did a lot of trash talking about which one of us would get his name up on the scoreboard first. We were constantly trying to outgeek each other with our knowledge of obscure Gunter trivia. Sometimes we even conduct our research together. This usually consisted of watching cheesy 80s movies and TV shows here in the chat room. We also played a lot of video games. H and I had wasted countless hours on two-player classics like Contra, Golden Axe, Heavy Barrel, Smash TV, and Ikira Warriors. Aside from yours truly, H was the best all-around gamer I had ever encountered. We were evenly matched at most games, but he could trounce me at certain titles, especially anything in the first-person shooter genre. That was his area of expertise, after all. I didn't know anything about who H was in the real world, but I got the sense his home life wasn't that great. Like me, he seemed to spend every waking moment logged into the Oasis, and even though we had never actually met in person, he had told me more than once that I was his best friend. So I assumed he was just as isolated and lonely as I was. "So what did you do after you bailed last night?" he asked, tossing me the other Intellivision controller. We had hung out here in his chat room for a few hours the previous evening, watching old Japanese monster movies. "Nada," I said. "Went home, brushed up on a few coin-op classics." "Unnecessary," he said. Yeah, but I was in the mood. I didn't ask him what he had done the night before, and he didn't volunteer any details. I knew he'd probably gone to Gygax or somewhere equally awesome to speed run through a few quests and rack up some XP. He just didn't want to rub it in. H could afford to spend a fair amount of time off-world, following up leads and searching for the copper key, but he never lorded this over me, or ridiculed me for not having enough dough to teleport anywhere, and he never insulted me by offering to loan me a few credits. It was an unspoken rule among Gunters: if you were a solo, you didn't want or need help from anyone. Gunters who wanted to help joined a clan, and H and I both agreed that clans were for suckasses and posers. We had both vowed to remain solos for life. We still occasionally had discussions about the egg, but these conversations were always guarded, and we were careful to avoid talking about specifics. After I beat H at 3 rounds of Tron Deadly Discs, he threw down his Intellivision controller in disgust and grabbed a magazine off the floor. It was an old issue of Starlog. I recognized Rutger Hauer on the cover in the Lady Hawk promotional photo. "Starlog, eh?" I said, nodding my approval. "Yep, downloaded every single issue from the Hatcheries archive. Still working my way through them. I was just reading this great piece on Ewoks, the battle for Endor." "Made for TV," I said. "Released in 1985. Star Wars trivia was one of my specialties." "Total garbage," I said. "A real low point in the history of the wars." "Says you, ass-face. It has some great moments," he retorted. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It doesn't. It's even worse than that first Ewoks flick. Caravan of Courage. They should have called it Caravan of Suck." H rolled his eyes and went back to reading. He wasn't going to take the bait. I eyed the magazine's cover. "Hey, can I have a look at that when you're done?" He grinned. "Why? So you can read the article on Lady Hawk?" "Maybe," I said. "Man, you just love that crap burger, don't you? Blow me, H. How many times have you seen that sap fest? I know you've made me sit through it at least twice." He was baiting me now. He knew Lady Hawk was one of my guilty pleasures, and that I had seen it over 24 times. "I was doing you a favor by making you watch it, noob," I said. I shoved a new cartridge into the Intellivision console and started up a single-player game of Astro Smash. "You'll thank me one day," I said. "Wait and see. Lady Hawk is canon." canon was the term we used to classify any movie, book, game, song, or TV show which Halliday was known to have been a fan of. Surely you must be joking, H said. No, I am not joking, and do not call me Shirley, I retorted. He lowered the magazine and leaned forward. There is no way Halliday was a fan of Ladyhawke, I guarantee it. Where's your proof, dipshit? I asked. The man had taste. That's all the proof I need. Then explain to me why he owned Ladyhawke on both VHS and Laserdisc, I said. A list of all the Halliday films in Halliday's collection at the time of his death were included in the appendices of Anorak's Almanac. We both had the list memorized. The guy was a billionaire. He owned millions of movies, most of which he probably never even watched. He had DVDs of Howard the Duck and Crawl, too. That doesn't mean he liked them, asshat, and it sure as hell doesn't mean they're canon, H said. It's not really up for debate, Homer, I said. Ladyhawke is an 80s classic. It's fucking lame is what it is, H said. The swords look like they were made out of tinfoil, and that soundtrack is especially lame, full of synthesizers and shit. By the motherfucking Alan Parsons Project. Lame-o-rama. Beyond lame. Highlander 2 lame. Hey, I feigned hurling my Intellivision controller at him. Now you're just being insulting. Ladyhawke's cast alone makes the film canon. Roy Beatty, Ferris Bueller, and the dude who played Professor Falcon in War Games. I searched my memory for the actor's name. John Wood. Reunited with Matthew Broderick. A real low point in both their careers, he said, laughing. He loved arguing about old movies, even more than I did. The other Gunters in the chat room were now starting to form a small crowd around us to listen in. Our arguments were often highly entertaining. You must be stoned, I shouted. Ladyhawke was directed by Richard fucking Donner. The Goonies, Superman the movie, you're saying that guy sucks? I don't care if Spielberg directed it, H says. It's a chick flick disguised as a sword and sorcery picture. The only genre film with less balls is probably freaking Legend. Anyone who actually enjoys Ladyhawke is a bona fide USDA choice pussy. Laughter from the peanut gallery. I was actually getting a little pissed off now. I was a big fan of Legend too, and H knew it. Oh, so I'm a pussy. You're the one with the Ewok fetish. I snatched the star log out of his hands and threw it against the Revenge of the Jedi poster on the wall. I suppose you think your extensive knowledge of Ewok culture is going to help you find the egg? Don't start on the Andorians again, man, he said, holding up an index finger. I've warned you. I will ban your ass, I swear. I knew this was a hollow threat, so I was about to push the Ewok thing further, maybe giving him some crap for referring to them as Andorians, but just then a new arrival materialized on the staircase. A total lamer by the name of IROC. I let out a groan. IROC and H attended the same school and had a few classes together, but I still couldn't figure out why H had granted him access to the basement. IROC fancied himself an elite Gunter, but he was nothing but an obnoxious poser. Sure, he did a lot of teleporting around Oasis, completing quests and leveling up his avatar, but he didn't know anything, and he was always brandishing an oversized plasma rifle the size of a snowmobile, even in chat rooms, where it was totally pointless. It didn't work. The guy had no sense of decorum. Are you cocks arguing about Star Wars again? He said, descending the staircase and walking over to join the crowd around us. That shit is so played out, yo. I turned to H. If you want to ban someone, why don't you start with this clown? I hit reset on the Intellivision and started another game. Shut your hole, Penisville, IROC replied, using his favorite mispronunciation of my avatar's name. He doesn't ban me because he knows I'm elite. Ain't that right, H? No, H said, rolling his eyes. That ain't right. You're about as elite as my great-grandmother, and she's dead. Screw you, H, and your dead grandma, IROC shouted. Gee, IROC, I muted. You always manage to elevate the intelligence level of any conversation you come into. The whole room just lights up the moment you arrive. So sorry to upset you, Captain No Credits, Irock said. Hey, shouldn't you be in Incipico panhandling for change right now? He reached for the second Intellivision controller, but I snatched it up and tossed it to H. He scowled at me. Prick. Poser. Poser? Penisville is calling me a poser? He turned to address the small crowd. This chump is so broke that he has to bum rides to Greyhawk so he can kill kobolds for copper pieces, and he's calling me a poser. This elicited a few snickers from the crowd, and I felt my face turn red under my visor. Once, about a year ago, I had made the mistake of hitching a ride off-world with Irock to try and gain a few experience points. After dropping me in a low-level quest area on Greyhawk, the jerk had followed me. I had spent the next few hours slaying a small band of kobolds, waiting for them to respawn, and then slaying them again, over and over, over and over. My avatar was still only first level at the time, and it was one of the only safe ways for me to level up. Irock had taken several screenshots of my avatar that night and labeled them Penisville, the mighty kobold slayer. Then he had posted them to the hatchery. He still brought it up every chance he got. He was never going to let me live it down. That's right. I called you a poser, poser. I stood up and got in his grill. You are an arrogant, know-nothing twink. Just because you're in 14th level, it doesn't make you a Gunter. You actually have to possess some kind of knowledge. Word, H said, nodding his agreement. We bump-fisted, more snickering from the crowd. Now directed at Irock. Irock glared at us for a moment. Okay, let's see who the real poser is, he said. Check this out, girls. Grinning, he produced an item from his inventory and held it up. It was an old Atari 2600 game, still in the box. He purposefully covered the game's title with his hand, but I recognized the cover art. It was a painting of a young man and woman in ancient Greek attire, both brandishing swords. Lurking behind them was a minotaur and a bearded guy with an eye patch. Know what this is, hotshot? Irock said, challenging me. I'll even give you a clue. It's an Atari game released as part of a contest. It contained several puzzles, and if you solved them, you could win a prize. Sound familiar? Irock was always trying to impress us with some clue or piece of Halliday lore he foolishly believed he had been the first to uncover. Gunters loved to play the game of one-upsmanship, and were constantly trying to prove they had acquired more obscure knowledge than anyone else. But Irock totally sucked at it. You're joking, right? I said. You just now discovered the Sword Quest series? Irock's posture deflated. You are holding Sword Quest Earthworld, I continued, the first game in the Sword Quest series, released in 1982. I smiled wide. Can you name the next 3 games in the series? His eyes narrowed. He was, of course, stumped. Like I said, a total poser. Anyone else? Anyone else? I said, opening the question to the floor. The Gunters in the crowd eyed each other, but no one spoke up. Fire World, Water World, and Air World, H answered right away. Bingo, I said, and we bumped fists again. Although Air World was never actually finished because Atari fell on hard times and canceled the contest before it was completed. Whatever. Irock quietly put the game back into his inventory. You should join up with the Suxors, Irock, H said, laughing. They could really use someone with your vast stores of knowledge. Irock flipped him the bird. If you two already knew about the Sword Quest contest, how come I've never heard you once mention it? Come on, Irock, H said, shaking his head. Sword Quest Earthworld was Atari's unofficial sequel to Adventure. Every Gunter worth their salt knows about the contest. Knows about Adventure. How much more obvious can you get? Laughter from the crowd. Irock tried to save some face. Okay, if you're both such experts, who programmed all of the Sword Quest games? Dan Hitchens and Todd Fry, we recited. Try asking me something difficult, I asked. I got one for you, H interjected. What were the prizes Atari gave out to the winners of each contest? Ah, I said. Good one. Let's see. The prize for the Earth world was the Talisman of Penultimate Truth. It was solid gold and encrusted with diamonds. And the kid who won it melted it down to pay for his college, as I recall. Yeah, H prodded. Quit stalling. What about the other two? Oh, no, I'm not stalling. The Fire World prize was the Chalice of Light, and the Water World prize was supposed to be the Crown of Life, but it was never awarded due to the cancellation of the contest. Same goes for the Air World prize, which was supposed to be the Philosopher's Stone. H grinned and gave me a double high five, and then added, and if the contest hadn't been cancelled, the winners of the 4 rounds would have competed for the grand prize, the Sword of Ultimate Sorcery. I nodded. The prizes were all mentioned in the Sword Quest comic books that the game came with. Comic books which happened to be visible in the treasure room in the final scene of Anorak's invitation, by the way. The crowd burst into applause. Irok lowered his head in shame. Since I'd become a Gunter, it had been obvious to me that Halliday had drawn inspiration for his contest from the Sword Quest contest. I had no idea if he had borrowed any of the puzzles from them too, but I had studied the games and their solutions thoroughly, just to be safe. Fine, you win, said Irok. But you both obviously need to get a life. And you obviously need to find a new hobby, I said. Because you clearly lack the intelligence and commitment to be a Gunter, I continued. No doubt, H said. Try doing some research for a change, Irok. I mean, did you ever hear of Wikipedia? It's free, douchebag. Irok turned and walked over to the long boxes of comic books stacked on the other side of the room, as if he had lost interest in the discussion. Whatever, he said over his shoulder. If I didn't spend so much time offline getting laid, I'd probably know just as much as you worthless shits, he muttered under his breath. H ignored him and turned back to me. What were the names of the twins who appeared in the Sword Quest comic books? Terra and Tor, I answered. Damn, Z, you are the man. Thanks, H. A message flashed on my display informing me that the 3-minute warning bell had just rung in my classroom. I knew H and Irok were seeing the same warning because our schools operated on the same schedule. Time for another day of higher learning, H said, standing up. Drag, Irok said. See you losers later. He gave me the finger, and then his avatar disappeared as he logged out of the chat room. The other Gunters began to log out and vanish too, until only H and I remained. Seriously, H, I said, why do you let that moron hang out here? Because he's fun to beat at video games, and his ignorance gives me hope, H said. How so? I asked. Because if most of the other Gunters out there are as clueless as Irok, and they are, Z, believe me, that means you and I actually have a chance at winning this contest. I shrugged. I guess that's one way to look at it. Want to hang after school again tonight? He said. Around 7 or so. I've got a few errands to run, but then I'm going to tackle some of the stuff on my need-to-watch list. A spaced marathon, perhaps? Oh, hell yes, I said. Count me in. We logged out simultaneously, just as the final bell began to ring.